Slides. So just quick introduction to who we are and what we do. We're a small consultancy based in Beeston and Nottingham. We work with public sector, established companies and startups, and we provide research that informs the design of products and services. So we do interviews, focus groups, surveys, user testing, data analysis, literally every type of design or user research that is possible. And this gives you an overview of some of our clients. There's a lot more than these, but it's just to give you an idea of the range of people we work with. So we've worked with the Education and Skills Funding Agency, Health Education England, and actually a few different parts of the NHS, like NHSX, which is mentioned down there, also NHS England and Improvement, the Pensions Regulator, Acceligres, who are a startup working in the transport space, and Lego's always in there because it's one that everyone knows and is a little bit cool. So to start about research, when and why do you do research? Well, obviously we would argue that you do research as early as possible and as often as possible. We often come across situations where especially startups will say it's too early for us to do any research, which always surprises me and shows really a misunderstanding about what research is for. Research should really start before any design starts, before anything is really decided about a product or service, no matter what the situation is in which it's being built, whether it's in an established company or whether it's in a startup, research comes first. And research can range from reading blogs, white papers, articles, to a multi-year longitudinal study. So it can go from very, very simple to very, very complicated. Research is always seen as something quite academic, quite hefty, quite onerous, quite long-winded, but actually research can be amount to asking a few questions and getting a few answers. So it's worth keeping an open mind as to what research involves and what you can do to fill that research need. Research ensures you're making informed decisions rather than guessing. And this is why I suppose we say do research right from the beginning, because especially when a new product or service is being developed, it's very important to make informed decisions and to not potentially go down the wrong path and find it difficult to come back from that. And research itself can be a source of ideas and innovation. So we have worked with startups who have started off with an idea. They've thought it was great. They have even a fully formed idea of what they're going to do. We've done some research for them, found out that there were maybe some very intractable barriers in that market or a very strong reason why that idea possibly wouldn't work, and then uncovered other ideas for them that are more feasible, more practical, and a thing that they can actually go with, and then they've gone with that successfully, so that it can actually uncover ideas. And what is research for? It should always be designed to answer specific questions. It should never be about collecting pointless data. So because research has this academic association, it can often be seen as putting out large surveys or trying to generate statistical reliability for something. But we would always argue that research with one user can be as valuable as research with 50 users. It's about answering a specific question and understanding a context and understanding a need. And the answers to your research questions should feed directly into a decision. If the research isn't informing a decision, don't do it, is what we always say. And so we're not in favor of research for the sake of research or large-scale research that's not necessary. It's all about identifying what do we need to know in this situation and finding that out in ways that are practical, simple, straightforward, and as quick as possible. Less data is usually better than more. And again, that's how design research differs from academic research. With academic research, you want to have data that covers large populations, is generalizable, has statistical reliability. For design research, it's often the case that you can just work with small numbers because you want to find out specific things, you want to know the context. And so the rich detail is better than having big data sets. Start small and build. So start with a small amount of data, start with a small amount of information, and then build from there. And often an initial piece of research will throw up questions that then need to be answered further along the line. And so it becomes a process of building an idea and a context and an understanding of a situation. And if you're not sure where to start with the following questions. What are we trying to achieve, and what will success look like? And these are always the questions that we start with clients when we sit down with them and they're trying to develop a new product or service. What are we trying to achieve as a business? What are we trying to achieve for our customers, or what are we trying to achieve for the users that we are working with? And what will success look like? If our solution works, if the thing we are trying to do is successful, what will that look like? And that's a surprisingly difficult question to answer at times, because people aren't always sure what they're trying to achieve. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve, then it's very hard to get there because you have no direction. So starting at that point can be a good way of setting yourself on a good path. So getting started with research. So I've put together a very kind of simple example from the healthcare field, as it's an area that we've worked in a lot. And it's a problem that everyone's aware of, which is that too many patients fail to attend clinic appointments, resulting in lost clinical time and longer waiting lists. So this is a problem that has been identified in healthcare systems, especially here in the UK, but also across lots of healthcare systems, especially post-COVID. And the need is fairly obvious, a way to ensure more patients attend their appointments. Now, there's a certain assumption in that need also, which I need to point out, which is that everyone should attend their appointments. And maybe that's not always the case, because there could be situations in which actually a patient not attending an appointment or not needing an appointment is a better result. But I'll come back to assumptions and how you deal with those later on. And of course, as researchers, our first port of call is understanding the problem. And again, in both startups and in established organizations, this is usually the step that's missing in developing new products and services. They don't always start with the problem. They don't always understand what the problem is and the complexities of that problem. And I've used a little picture here that's from GDS, if anyone's familiar with it, the Government Digital Service, which the first principle of which is start with user needs. So everything that the Government Digital Service is involved with, developing the new passport service, developing recycling systems for companies, always starts with user needs. What do people need in this situation? You need to ask why the problem exists, what's going on here, what are the complexities of this situation, and beware of assumptions. So you need to interrogate the problem or the need. Whose point of view is being taken? So going back to the problem that we looked at, too many patients fail to attend clinic appointments, resulting in lost clinical time and longer waiting lists. It's obvious here that the point of view that's been taken is the clinician's point of view or the healthcare system's point of view. It's not the patient's point of view. So the clinicians are saying, we're giving appointments to patients and they're not attending. Looking at the point of view is really important, because framing the problem from a specific point of view gives you a specific perspective. And it's not always the right perspective depending on the problem that you're trying to solve. Do we know what the user needs? So in this situation, do we know what the patient needs? Do we know what the issue is that's going on with them? What assumptions might be made in this situation? And assumptions are very important to look at, because they can send you down the wrong road very easily. The things that you think you know about the situation that you don't always aren't always correct, or often almost correct, but not quite. And how can those assumptions be challenged? And when you're challenging your assumptions, the first thing you need to do is write down what you know about the problem. So write down all the information that you have in your head or as a team about the problem that you're addressing. And then ask, is there evidence for this? Because there will be a lot of things that people think they know about a situation, but without evidence, you can never state for sure that that's actually the case. So if the answer is no to that question, is there evidence for this? Then you're guessing or assuming. And the next step, of course, is to use research to gather evidence and to make sure that what you actually know about the situation is actually what's happening. And keep an open mind. And this is the thing we struggle with in both startups and or bigger organizations. There tends to be a real desire to jump straight to the solution. We know what's happening, and now the solution is an app, an online platform, a new system, a new process. We need to encourage them to step back and say, okay, that is potentially the solution, but keep an open mind. Let's explore the problem first. Let's really understand what's going on. And then we can think about a solution, because until you understand the problem, you don't know if your solution's ever going to work in that situation. And there may be very obvious things that you come across in the research that means the original solution that you thought might work simply won't. And that happens quite a lot. So the part of the reason I chose missed appointments as a thing to look at is because in 2022, Rishi Sunak proposed fining patients in the UK £10 for missed appointments. So it was a well-known issue within the NHS that people were missing appointments, and his solution was, let's fine them. That will reduce lack of attendance, and it will increase the number of people who attend their appointments, and it will make sure that there are fewer missed appointments. The response from the clinical community was quite emphatic. But I suppose the three questions to ask here are, what is the assumption here? I mean, obviously the assumption is that patients are not attending appointments out of choice. So they could attend, they have the ability to attend, but they're deciding not to. I can't be bothered. I'm going to sit here and watch TV instead of going to an appointment. And if you charge them £10, then that will solve the problem, because they now have a disincentive to avoid failing to attend. And so they will now attend their appointment. There's a huge number of assumptions going on there, which is quite complicated, but it all comes back to, if we punish people, they'll behave the way we want them to behave. What is the danger of this assumption is a big question. So a very obvious danger that was asked by the clinical community, or one of the things that was raised by the clinical community, was that this would actually disincentivize people from attending at all, or for wanting to make an appointment in the first place in case they forgot it. It would also punish people who were more vulnerable, so people who are more likely to fail to attend due to mobility issues or illness. Obviously, with clinical appointments, you are dealing with people who are ill, and so they might be in situations more often than others where they can't leave the house, or where they're unable to attend for a good reason. And so they argued that there was too many assumptions going on here, and that you cannot use this as a way of fixing this problem. And of course, then the next question is, what question should be asked about this problem? Well, of course, it's why. Why are people failing to attend appointments? What is going on here? Is it laziness? Is it just lack of willingness to attend? Or are there other things going on? And that's true of any problem that you're dealing with. You want to ask, why is this happening? What's going on here? Let's delve into the detail and the context. So the first step, obviously, is to do some research. So the easiest and most low-hanging fruit in any situation is looking at existing research. There's a lot of academic research out there. There are a lot of blogs, white papers. There will be articles in newspapers, lots of information out there gathered by other people that you can use, often for free. The caveat being that, obviously, if you look at research that's been carried out in a different culture or a different context, you have to be aware that it might not apply to the culture or context that you're working in. So the healthcare system in the US is so different from the healthcare system in the UK that you might not be able to apply a lot of the learnings here, but it's worth knowing what's happening in other systems nonetheless. And of course, another obvious one is to identify a range of patients who have not attended appointments and ask them why. So go to the source and actually ask. And this is something that's often overlooked, partly because I think people are a bit worried about it. It seems like a lot of effort, but even just talking to 2 or 3 patients, or talking to 2 or 3 users in whatever context can start to open your mind to, okay, there's a lot more going on here than I thought. And just exploring the issue, and again, keeping an open mind, figuring out what's going on, gives you a huge amount of insight into the area that you're trying to work in before you go in and do something like finding people, which will cause more problems than solve. And look at the whole system as well. Are there barriers that prevent attendance? Is there something that is outside of the control of clinicians and patients that means that attendance is difficult? And of course, when you come to then talking to people, whether that's talking to patients or clinicians or people who are working within the system, it's important to ask the right questions. And there are various different ways that questions can go wrong, but in our experience, these are kind of the key things that you need to avoid. The first one is leading questions. And this is a very easy trap to fall into, where you signal to the person that you're talking to that there is a certain response that you're expecting, or there's a certain thing that you expect them to say. And leading questions are related to closed questions, of course, where it's a yes/no question. I'm going to set it up for you, and you're going to say yes or no. The thing to flag up here, I suppose, is that when you're in a situation with a person you're interviewing, even if they're quite a powerful person, say somebody who works in a healthcare system who's quite experienced, they still might feel reticent about saying no to you. So if you set up a situation where it's a yes/no answer, they may say yes, or they may fail to say no because they don't want to contradict you, or they feel confused. They feel like you're queuing them up to say something and they don't want to knock you down and say, actually, no, that's not the situation. So keeping questions open is really important. So in this situation, I've put in an example. Do you agree that patients miss appointments due to poor planning? I mean, obviously, that's a very leading question. You set up what you expect the person to say. And if the person doesn't agree with you, then they have to actively disagree, which is hard for people to do, as I was saying. This is a huge problem, I think, across the second one is a huge problem across research, especially design research, hypothetical questions. So people fall into the trap of asking, if there was a solution like this, would you use it? There's a couple of reasons why this is not a good question to ask. One is that people are very poor predictors of their future behavior. They can tell you what they did yesterday, they can tell you what they did last week, but they can't necessarily tell you what they're going to do in the future unless there's some really set out plan that they're following. Also, when you ask people a hypothetical question, they will often say yes, because why not? Unless there's a very good reason why they won't use it because there's some huge barrier. They think, yeah, okay, this looks like it might solve my problem. Yeah, why not? But they don't really know the context. They don't know how that system or process is going to work. And so they're not basing it on any knowledge or experience. They're guessing and they're answering the question that you've asked them, but they're not necessarily giving you any useful information that you can actually go on. And asking pointless questions. So do you think this is a big problem? The person might say yes. I mean, so what if they think it's a big problem? It has to be a question that leads to an understanding of some sort. And asking big, vague, or unspecific questions can give you information that's not really that useful. The key really is to explore the problem that you're looking at. Keep an open mind, try and find out what's happening, and don't get yourself too narrow down a particular path too early. So in this case, if you were talking to patients who've missed an appointment, you would just ask them a really open question, but you would want to keep it specific to begin with, because if you say, tell me about when you've missed an appointment, the person might think back to when they were 16 and they were at school and they missed an appointment because of something that happened then. That's not that relevant now to this person. So you might say, tell me about the last time you missed an appointment. Access a specific memory, a specific circumstance, so you get more detail and more solid information about what actually happened at that time. So what happened? It allows a very open question for that person to explore. And then you listen to what that person says and you follow up on it. You do not lead them down a particular track, but you hear and listen, and listening is very important. And then you hear something that's interesting. So they mention, oh, I tried to get to the appointment. It was in Clinic B. I got to the hospital. I asked them where Clinic B was. They had no idea what I was talking about. And I was really frustrated. Of course, at that point, you would say, tell me more. Why did that happen? Well, what happened next? And so you want to hear more detail about that because that's an interesting issue. And of course, the person says, well, I wandered around the hospital. I went down corridor south. I went down corridor north and I couldn't find the clinic and I went home. So I missed my appointment because I simply couldn't find it. And that's a real life issue in a hospital that we know of, where people struggle to find the clinics because the hospital is such a big hospital and they tend to move around quite a lot. And a question to ask, but with a pinch of salt, and I suppose this is where research becomes a little bit more difficult, especially if you're not experienced with it, is knowing how to ask a question and knowing how to interpret the answer, because you could ask, what, if anything, could have made that situation better? Often in that situation, people will say, nothing really, there was nothing I could really do. Sometimes they will make a suggestion and say, well, if you had a really big map that showed where everything was, then that would really help. I suppose the caveat to raise there is that the person might suggest a solution and you're interpreting that as a researcher to understand more about the problem. When someone suggests a solution or suggests something that helps, what you're listening for is, what are you looking for here? So it's not the solution. They're not giving you a solution that you might develop. They're giving you an idea of what they need. And so pulling out lots of different suggestions or lots of different thoughts is really useful to map what people think would help them in this situation and to understand what's possible. And of course, once you've done your interview, so say if we've interviewed 12 people who've missed appointments, 12 patients, we'll analyse the data and maybe pull out the key reasons why they've missed an appointment. So we'll say the patient 1 missed the bus, patient 2 couldn't find the clinic and had to give up and go home, like I say, an actual issue that we've come across. Patient 3 couldn't attend but couldn't cancel. They just couldn't figure out. They looked at everything they had and they couldn't find a way to cancel easily. Patient 4, their symptoms disappeared because there was a big long gap between their initial consultation and their clinic appointment, and they felt like there was no reason to bother the consultant, so they just didn't go. Patient 6 slept in. Patient 7 felt fine and had recently seen the GP, so figured, look, there's no need to go to this appointment, I'm okay. Patient 8 deteriorated, went into hospital and could not cancel because they were very unwell. Patient 9 ended up in the wrong part of the hospital, missed the appointment time, went home. Patient 10 forgot about the appointment. Patient 11 didn't understand what the appointment was for, so they didn't understand, the letter said cardiovascular, and they thought, I don't know what cardiovascular means, and so I'm not going to go to that because I don't know what it means. And patient 12 couldn't access the clinic due to mobility issues. So it was in a temporary building, it was up a few steps and they couldn't get in. And so when you've done your interviews, then you want to figure out, are there ways, there are multiple things that are coming out of this research that we can identify as themes? Are there things that are repeating that come together in a way that makes sense? And so theme 1 might be patient error. So something that is involved in that patient's life, like sleeping in, missing the bus, forgetting. Theme 2 might be that clinic is hard to find or inaccessible. So something about the physical location of the clinic. Theme 3, there was no way to cancel easily, so couldn't figure out how I would tell people that I can't go because there's a legitimate reason why I can't go and I can't actually cancel. And theme 4 is that the patient doesn't understand the need for the appointment. So the information that they were given wasn't clear enough and they just didn't know that they needed to attend. And I suppose what research like this might indicate, and I suppose something to show Rishi Sunak, is to say, actually, when you delve into this situation, you realize there are lots of really legitimate reasons why patients don't attend appointments. Patients have lives, they're sensible people, they make decisions, they try to manage lots of different things, and lots of the time they're also ill. And so they're in a situation that could be quite difficult to manage. So when they don't attend an appointment, it's often for reasons that are completely legitimate. And even things like sleeping in can happen to anybody. It's not done deliberately or maliciously in a way that needs to be punished. And what you might do next, and this is an approach that we like to take often, especially with discovery research, is to do a piece of qualitative research where we explore the context and really understand from the people's mouths what's going on. And then we use a survey we use that qualitative research to help us to build a survey that we put out to a much bigger audience to say, actually, do these themes exist in a much wider audience? So we've seen it in a smaller group. What happens when we put it out to a bigger group? Do they also agree? Do some themes appear more in particular populations? So is there something about older people that is different to younger people? Is there something about people with a certain illness that's different to other people who have other illnesses, and so on? And are there other themes not already identified? So does something come out of a survey that we haven't seen in these original pieces of research? Surveys, one thing I will flag up about surveys is that people think, oh, a survey, you just put together a few simple questions, send it out to people, ask it them, and you get loads of data back. Surveys are quite difficult to create in a way that makes sense to people, because you have to remember that every person who reads a survey needs to be able to understand and interpret the question and answer it as accurately as possible. And it's quite hard to create a question that applies to a lot of different people. The language can be difficult to craft. The type of question can be difficult to craft. And so if you're unsure about how to build a survey, it's worth trying to look at a few resources as to how you might do that. We have some resources on our website. Or get the help of somebody who is experienced in writing a survey for a quick tutorial, because I've been in situations before with people who say, oh, we could ask this question, and I'll say no and explain, and we go back and forth, no, 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 no. And it's quite a honing process to get to that question that really nails what it is you're trying to find. And in a survey, you need to be very specific. Ask about a particular time frame or type of appointment, because if you keep it too open and general, the data might be quite flaky and difficult to interpret. You need to be able to put all of your data in context. We know of the people who have missed appointments over the last 12 months. So post-COVID, for example, have missed their appointments due to these reasons. Because if you've missed appointments over the last 4 or 5 years, then you have to remember that COVID happened in the middle of that. That's quite a big thing to take into account, and does mess with the data. So this is just a sample question, and this is by no means a perfect question. There's lots of things I could bring up here that may be issues, but you might want to ask a question about, you have your themes, and you might want to frame it in a way that the person who is answering the survey is able to interpret it in their own context. So think about the last time you missed an appointment and didn't cancel in advance. And it's very important to state that, because you're looking at people who just didn't turn up to their appointment. If they cancelled, no harm, no foul. Obviously, they've engaged with the system and that appointment became available. But if they didn't cancel, then why? What was the issue? And which of the following most closely fits your situation? And I've put here, tick all that apply. You have to do things like that with care, because if you're allowing people to choose multiple reasons, then analysing the data after the fact can be a bit difficult, because you can't say 20% of people chose this, because they may have chosen 2 or 3 different reasons. So it might be quite a complex mix of reasons why they didn't attend, which you need to be able to interpret. So this is where we get into the weeds of surveys and how complicated they can be. But you might just give them a list. I didn't make it on time due to issues with transport. I forgot about the appointment. I couldn't attend due to illness, and so on and so forth, all the various reasons. You might decide, actually, this list is too long. So having a very long list might be difficult. So you might say, actually, I don't really care if you didn't make it due to on time due to issues of transport, because we can't do anything about transport. So I'm going to take that out as a reason. I'm not interested in the number of people who did that. Or you might make an argument, I'll leave that in because I want to know about that reason, because it takes a chunk out of the people we're looking at who are interested in. So we know those people have an issue that we can't solve. We can see how many of them exist, and we can look at maybe putting that out there as an issue, that public transport is not good enough, but it's not necessarily something we can deal with. So there's a lot of discussion there and thought that needs to go into that process of developing the questions, even quite a simple question like this. And what next? So once you've done your interviews, once you've done your survey, once you've gotten your data, what do you do next? You need to examine the so what of what you found. So what if certain people couldn't get to their appointments due to transport? Do we care about that? Yes, potentially, because it's part of the wider system. Can we do anything about that? No, potentially, because we don't have any control over it. But you might want to look at the whole system within what you can control. So ease of access to the clinic, for example. Can you make sure that nothing is up steps, especially if there's a mobility issue that people are tackling at that time? Can you make sure that the place that is always easily signposted and people can always find where they're going? A good up-to-date map, for example. Are things unnecessarily difficult or complicated for patients? And as I was saying, some things you can fix and other things you can't. And a lot of this exploratory research is about understanding the things that you can't fix. Because often when we work with organizations, even the NHS or startups, they try to fix a very, very big problem, a very, very complicated problem, and they want to solve the whole thing using an app, using an online platform. And sometimes the research can show actually there are certain things you can't fix, but there are certain specific things that you really can make a difference on. And a big part of this research is identifying those things. What could we really fix? What could we make better in this circumstance? What could we have an influence on? Identify what's possible. You might want to break it down into different areas: ease of access, ease of cancellation, avoiding errors and reminders, clearer information so patients understand the need to attend. And there is some work being done in this area by some really interesting companies. One of the things they're looking at is patient-initiated follow-up, for example, which means that rather than just bringing a person to a clinic every 3 months, which obviously is a standard appointment that everyone has to attend, which then may not be attended by as many as 10% of patients. You say to a patient, actually, it's up to you to let us know if you need a follow-up. And until then, we will assume that you're fine. And so it's putting some control back into the patient's hands. And then it frees up some time in the clinical system as well for the people who really need those appointments. That's not a straightforward solution, of course, because you are relying on patients understanding when they need that help, but you are ensuring that there isn't just this regular treadmill of appointments that people feel they have to attend. So there can be quite innovative and maybe quite complex solutions that open up the power of the system to patients. Now, I was looking there specifically at a healthcare issue and looking at a problem within a system, but obviously if you're developing a commercial product or service, your approach might be quite different. So maybe less about solving a particular problem and more about adding value. So potentially your users could do without the thing that you are providing, but you're providing something that they will pay for because it will make their life easier. But you still need to focus on the need. You must still focus on why will people pay for this? What will they be getting from it? What is the purpose of this thing that I'm developing? And you need to pinpoint the difference the product or service will make in people's lives. What is it worth to them? Does the value match what you might ask them to pay? And that's quite a key question you need to ask, because if you're developing a very, very complex process that takes an awful lot of money to develop, but people will only pay a very small amount for it, does that match? Can you make a viable business out of something that is extremely expensive to develop, but will only attract a small investment from your users? It is something to think about, and something to think about early on. And as ever, challenge assumptions. So I'm going to talk a bit about a project that we did last year, which is in the transport area. And the problem is, it's a well-known problem that electric vehicle owners struggle to find available chargers when they need them, leading to anxiety, frustration, stress, missed appointments, etc. So, and it can also make electric vehicles very unattractive. So if you own an electric vehicle, you need to be able to, on a long journey, stop at some point, plug your car into a charger, charge it back up again, and go on to your destination. Mainly because electric vehicles don't have a long range. They can't often go more than 160 miles at a time. And so if you cannot do that, if you can't find a charger on your journey, it could mean that you can't use your car for long journeys. So it's a big barrier to EV ownership. And so an obvious need is a way to improve access to chargers, making charging easier and more reliable, and therefore EVs more attractive. And the assumption in this project was being able to reserve chargers in advance will help to solve this problem, reducing anxiety and stress and making EVs more attractive. But it seems like an obvious solution. It seems like jumping to a solution, but actually we rode back a level and said, right, let's firstly do some discovery research. Let's understand what's going on with EV owners and what their needs are. So we explored the market, we did desk research, we talked to experts such as Planner for Transport for London, charge point operators, providers of information around charging. And I suppose a thing to flag up here as well is that experts in a particular field are often quite willing to share their expertise and talk about what they've done, especially if they're in a less commercial facing role. So say, for example, Transport for London does a lot of work in this area. They don't necessarily sell the information that they have, but they're quite happy to talk about it to people who are interested in it because they're interested in improving the situation as much as anybody else. So they can be a huge source of general information about the market, about what's going on, about solutions that have been tried before and maybe worked or didn't work. And we also talked to EV owners, exploring their experiences of owning an EV. So why did they decide to own one? What has been their experience? Has it been positive or negative? What have been the issues around charging and so on? And a key one here that I've highlighted is how they've tried to solve the problems with charging. And this is true of any situation. If you look at a problem and you look at how the users are currently solving that problem, that can be a massive source of insight, because if I've developed my own solution, be that a spreadsheet or a piece of paper or a whiteboard or whatever it is, that gives you a huge indication as a researcher about what that person needs from a solution. And sometimes it can be a matter of taking the solution that already exists, the quite badly made solution, and making it better, more reliable, smoother, slicker, or adding some element to it, and not reinventing the wheel, giving people what they need in that situation and what they've already developed. And we also asked reactions to the idea of reserving chargers, with caveat, of course, that that's hypothetical. So we just wanted to know, what do you think of that concept? With the pinch of salt that even if people think it's great, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to use it in the future. And the results of the research showed that there was a clear need for the situation with charging to improve, which wasn't a surprise. We know it's an issue in the world of EV ownership, and that there was an interest in the idea of reservations. But the research highlighted, of course, that not all EV drivers are the same. Some are commuters, some are tourists, some are locals, some are travelers. And of course, you can be a commuter in one situation and a tourist in another. And so your needs in those different situations might be different. And of course, as well, with the idea of reservations, people raised some concerns. What if I'm late? What if the charger is reserved and it's empty? What if I reserve a charger and it's broken? Will reservations add to the cost of the charging session? And so it gave us a lot of different things to consider in terms of the specific needs of different EV drivers and what they might need from the minutiae of how the service works to reassure them that they're not going to end up having less access to chargers or to be fined because they didn't make it to a charger on time. And so we're still working, looking at more in this project, looking at next steps about those needs of different users. And the aim is to develop, whether reservations forms part of that or not, is to develop a product that fits seamlessly into the charging process and helps EV owners to get that access that they need and the reassurance that they can get access, so that the stress of potentially not finding a charger is reduced. And the things to remember around research are context is really important. So the why and the so what are very important. So you need to look at, if I know this piece of information, what does that mean? What's the implication? What decision am I making based on it? So for example, a piece of data like 60% of users are satisfied with this product. I mean, what's the so what there? What does satisfied mean? Why are they satisfied? And there's a tendency towards vanity metrics like that in a lot of organizations or a lot of industries, which doesn't actually help very much. It doesn't let you know what you're doing right or wrong. It doesn't let you know what you need to continue to do or maybe stop doing, what's causing an issue in this situation, what's happening with the other 40% who are not satisfied potentially. Your aim is to articulate the value you bring to users. And this is very important if you're looking for grant funding or if you're looking for investment. You need to say what it is you bring to users in that context. Why do they use the product or service? What difference does it make to them? And if you can't articulate the value, there may be none. And that does happen, where if you can't specify what it is you're bringing to a user, there may be nothing that you're actually bringing to the user, and nothing valuable, nothing that they will pay for, or nothing that will make their lives easier. So we'll move on to questions.
Yeah, so you talked at the start about, obviously you can spend a lot of time on research or very little or whatever in between. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about sort of how you decide, or how do you decide how much you need to invest your time, money, etc. in research?
I mean, that's how long is a piece of string, isn't it? I mean, I think it is possible to do too much research. So I think that's the surprising answer that people don't always expect, because I think research can take you so far in a certain length of time, and then you need to stop and think again. So I think when you're identifying what sort of research you need to sit down with your team and think, where are we and where do we need to go next? And then what can take us there? And once you get to another, I suppose, for want of a better way of putting it, it's sort of an iterative process. You need to unlock the next level, so to speak. So where are we? Do we already know quite a lot about the problem? So we've done a lot of kind of background research, or there's people who know this area really, really well. And so we know all the background. And so the next step maybe is something really specific that we need to find out. So we just need to go to this one place and ask a few questions. And often when you start to do research, that will open up other questions. And that can get a bit frustrating for people who are not used to it. I suppose the thing that we say, reassure people with, is this it's good that other questions open up, because you want those questions to open up early and not late. Because if they open up late, then they might cause a lot of problems. So the more questions that open up, the better. And then you need to answer those questions until you get to a point where you think, we have enough knowledge now to do something. We have enough to feed into a decision, and then we'll make that decision, and then we'll go from there. I hope that it's a bit general, but I suppose the ideal situation is where research comes in as it's needed. And anytime there's kind of an open question or a decision to be made and the information isn't there, research comes in whatever form it is, which is even just reading blogs, as I say. And then enough information is gathered so we can now make the decision, we can move it on another step, and then we'll see what we need to do next. And spending too long sticking in one spot and not making any decisions can become paralyzing, and it can happen. Too much research, too much information gathered, and not enough decisions being made. Because when you make a decision, then that opens up the next step, and that opens up the new bunch of questions that you need to ask. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, no, that's good. And we have one here. So if you've got a specific group of a group for research, how do you avoid giving them research fatigue? Say if you want to talk to them quite a lot.
That's a really good question. And people can become professional participants, which is an issue, where they participate in so much research that the minute you sit down with them, they're firing off the answers, and you just think, oh, you know what I'm looking for. So I suppose it's not an easy one to deal with, and research fatigue is a real issue, especially if your group is quite small. I would say, if you can avoid it at all, try to not to use the same group over and over. Or if you can't avoid it, then accept that there are going to become professional participants and make them professional participants. So you might want to promote them from just a basic participant who is kind of naive and out in the world to someone who has actually got a bit more investment in the process. That avoids participation fatigue, because it elevates their position from, I'm just going to sit you down and ask you loads of questions and mine you for information, to someone who actually has an active part in the process, and it can be more engaging for them. And you might want to introduce methods like co-design, where they actually have an influence on how you progress and use their responses, especially if they're very experienced and if they have a lot to say. That's a little bit of a judgment call depending on the situation. And if you want to ask a follow-up question on that one, please do, whoever's asked that question, because that might not have covered what you're asking, but I hope it sort of at least gives you an idea of what to do with it.
Yeah, I suppose so specifically asking about a citizen forum, it's worth saying. So, which is interesting, because it's something we've sort of done a bit of work with in terms of planning authorities.
Yeah, and I think a citizen forum, it depends again what it is, but sometimes they can become a bit of a, and this is not a criticism, and not saying that this is the situation that you're in, but we've seen it where it's a bit like, we have a thing, we've made a decision, what do you think? We are doing a thing, what do you think? And so this citizen forum kind of gets these same questions over and over, but never really gets to be involved in shaping the decisions being made. And I think they don't necessarily get participation fatigue or research fatigue. They get annoyed legitimately at being constantly asked questions that they feel don't really have an input on anything they can see, or they don't see that the difference that they're making. And so I think making sure that that forum has a real position and is really having an influence, and the people involved can really see it, can be very motivating for them. But again, like I say, you can expand their role as well. So say, for example, it's similar in medical, research and healthcare. Sometimes you'll have a patient participation group, and sometimes they can be just wheeled in every so often. We're going to wheel you in and going to run this by you, and we've made decisions already, but here, what do you think? And now we could tick a box. And people get wise to that very fast. But if they feel like actually our viewpoint is being listened to and we can see the input that we're having, then they feel much more ownership, and that fatigue is much less, I think.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about as well, isn't it? It's what you're saying, why they are participating, making sure that you're servicing that, which, like you say, is it's often they want sway, they want to help make the decisions and not just be a box tick. But also, I think, I mean, especially with citizen forums, thinking about who isn't in the room and why as well. So people who aren't engaged, why are they not engaged? Because often the problem is if you're getting fatigue in that situation, it's often because you've got quite a small sort of group compared to the large population. Because if you're talking about a local authority or something, very large potential population, anyone could be in the room. So thinking about who is there and why they're there, and equally the other side of that in terms of who's not engaging and why they're not engaging as well. So trying to think about those sort of side of things as well, I think is useful.
Yes, and very much avoid a situation where you're asking a question of people where you know they're not going to have any influence. I've seen that happen, and that's very disrespectful. And I'm going to say that quite categorically. I've seen situations where people have been, you know, what's your opinion of X or Y, or do you think we should do X or Y? And people say, no, you shouldn't do it. And then say, well, tough, we're going to do it anyway. And the question then is, why ask? If the person has no influence, then, or no way to change that decision, then why ask? And if people get wise to that very fast, I think they see that quite clearly. I'm not having any influence in this situation, so why am I going to bother getting involved?
Yeah, I've got one more one for you. So we talked a bit about evidence as well near the start. So I suppose if you could just expand a little bit on what you mean by evidence and what makes good evidence.
Michael, tough questions. I mean, at the very, very least, the evidence is something that exists outside your own opinion. So it's something that comes from somewhere else. I mean, that's the most basic form of it, really. So I've spoken to people in situations where they say, you know, we know that this situation is happening. And I'll say, why? And they'll say, well, I've worked in this area for 20 years. Now, that, not to devalue that experience, but your experience is your experience and you work in a very particular context. So that evidence is not worth nothing, but it's potentially not as worth as much as if you even just go to your colleagues and say, what's your experience of this situation? What's going on here? Because context can have a huge, huge influence. And so it's expanding beyond a party of one, I suppose, is the basic. And then evidence that is verified or appears multiple times also is quite good evidence. So for example, when I went through those interview answers, you could see there was a few things that were coming out multiple times. You know, I can't find the clinic. I didn't find a way to cancel. Repeating the same thing over and over often does give you a bit of security. Okay, this is getting stronger. You know, it's not just one person is saying this. This is multiple times, multiple contexts, multiple situations. And of course, if you then take the evidence from your interviews and say, right, well, this is a small group, we're going to ask a bigger group. And then you say, okay, actually, we've asked 200, 300 people and we're seeing the same patterns come out again, then the evidence is stronger. But I suppose just to flag up there as well, like I said earlier, it's not like academic research necessarily where you want statistical reliability, because potentially you're never going to get that, especially with really context dependent stuff. So there's a bit of a judgment call there of saying, actually, we've gotten to a point now where we know well enough what's happening here. And we know with enough confidence that this is happening because we've seen it beyond one person, we've seen it beyond one group. And so let's take a step forward here. Let's try and move into this area. And then as soon as a new area of uncertainty opens up, let's try again to get more evidence. So I suppose, like say, going back to that iterative process of building your evidence over time until you get to a point where you have so much evidence that you're like, actually, I'm pretty clear on what's happening here. The other flag there is that evidence goes stale. So what you might have known a couple of years ago, say in the electric vehicle charging market, that's changing quite rapidly. And so you might have some evidence from 2020, 2019 that actually now is out of date. Or in the healthcare field, COVID just made such a big difference that stuff that you're looking at from 2018, 2019 might just not be true at all now anymore. So you have to look at that as well. Has the context changed? And it can be a little bit mind-boggling, some of that, putting all the pieces together. And I suppose that's where having someone help to do that helps, because we're quite experienced at going, that piece of information is not that relevant in this situation. This is the thing you need to focus on. And it's a skill you can develop over time as well, knowing what to focus on and knowing what's relevant in a particular situation. But it's not always easy, I would say. You can book a free follow-up call. So if there's any sort of questions you have or anything you'd like to follow up on, go ahead and book in a call. And you can also sign up to our newsletter. So we let you know we've got other events and other things and resources and so on that we have. And also our website is full of stuff that you can use for free. Appreciate your time taking listening to me going on and on. And like I say, any follow-ups, any further questions, feel free to ask.